Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to start talking about television and the rise of television and the really interesting ways in which television was going to not simply become a popular pastime for people, but transform the nature of American life. So let's get into this. Let's talk about the technology. Now, we get the first broadcast radio in the United States in the early 1920s. And the technology to send voice over the airwaves existed before the 1920s, but where you actually start getting radio stations and the broadcasting of programming on radio was in the 1920s. And once you could send sound over the airwaves, people understood that as time went on, they would eventually be able to figure out how to send images. If you could do one, you could do the other. It was just going to be more complicated, and it was going to take more time. So when television did eventually appear, it wasn't like some sort of giant shock that surprised everybody. People were predicting it was going to happen. Once you had radio, people understood. In fact, a lot of the people involved in the major corporations that were involved in radio became very much involved in the creation of television because they understood that was likely going to be the future. Companies like NBC and CBS that we know of today now more for television were going to get their start in radio and would actively be involved in the creation of television technology. Now, we get the first public display of television in 1939 at the 1939 World's Fair in New York City. We got the first display of television technology. But the implementation of television was delayed because of the outbreak of World War II. America enters World War II in 1941. It starts in 1941, ends in 1945 for the United States. World War II started in Europe in 1939. And so the fear of war coming and eventually the reality of war coming slowed the implementation of television. But once the war ended in 1945, companies could start focusing their attention that were involved in this new technology and bringing it to the American public. So you started to get broadcast television in 1946. One of the problems in the beginning, however, was the problem of what comes first. Is there a lot of programming on that is available, or do people go out and buy televisions? See, initially, both sides, the supply and the demand side, were kind of out of whack. People didn't want to buy televisions in the beginning because, one, they were very expensive, and two, there wasn't much programming on. Why wasn't there much programming on? Because programming for television was very expensive. This is something we're going to talk about in more detail. Television requires a lot of money. In a lot of ways, more so than many of the other areas of popular culture that we talk about. With so few televisions available in the beginning, 1946, 1947, 1948, people involved in the television industry didn't want to spend a lot of money on programming in the beginning because there weren't very many televisions out there. As we'll talk about, television requires advertisers. And why would advertisers want to spend much money on helping to create television programming if there weren't very many televisions out there. So we have a classic what comes first, the chicken or the egg sort of scenario. The American public, many of which wanted television and wanted to watch television, initially didn't want to buy TVs because it was expensive and there wasn't much programming on. And so potential buyers were delaying. They were waiting. They were waiting for prices for televisions to come down, and they were waiting for more programming to make it worth their while to spend the money to buy a TV. On the other side, programmers were kind of waiting for more people to buy televisions so that they could get more advertising revenue that would allow them to start making money off creating that programming. So it's really not until we get to the early 1950s where things are starting to become more equaled out, where gradually you're getting more programming and more people are buying TVs, and these two trends start to reinforce each other. The more people were buying TVs, the more programming was coming on. The more programming that was starting to come on, the more people were willing to buy TVs. Also, as more people were buying TVs, the prices of televisions started to come down as television manufacturers could make more money off volume of sales than the profit off each individual TV as having to be substantial because they weren't selling that many televisions. So by the time we get to the middle 1950s, any middle class person that wanted to buy a TV could pretty much afford to do it. As we'll talk about in a little while, TVs were still really expensive. But more and more people by the middle 1950s in the middle class were owning TVs. In fact, it was becoming something of a status symbol within the home. Like, do you own a TV? And kind of keeping up with the neighbors, keeping up with the Joneses in terms of buying a TV. By the time we get to the 1950s, most middle class people that wanted a TV, and by the way, there were significant numbers of people that didn't want TVs. This was a new kind of intrusive technology for some people. They didn't want that big box sitting in the middle of their living room, taking up space, looking real ugly, putting on programming that they weren't terribly interested in. So, there were people that didn't buy TVs initially and didn't want them in their home, not because they were expensive or not because there was a lack of programming, simply because they didn't want one of those things in their home. But most people in the middle class by the middle 1950s had televisions and were watching them. Okay. Television was big business. Okay. Now, early on with radio and the development of radio, one of the things that delayed the development of radio was a certain amount of problem figuring out how to monetize, how to make money off radio. We've seen this more recently in recent decades with the internet, where you get this amazing technology, but people are unsure how they can take this interesting technology and make money off of it. This was a problem 100 years ago with radio initially, which is there's this amazing technology to be able to send sound through airwaves, but how are we going to get people to pay for it? How are we going to charge them for it? Subscription-based technologies? They didn't have a way to really make that convenient. And so eventually what the radio industry figured out was advertising. We will pay. We will create content, put it on the radio. People will listen to it for free. Once you bought that radio, when you turned it on, everything you were hearing was free. But we'll get advertisers to pay for creating that content. Advertisers will pay for that content. And our ability to get an audience will make money through advertisers. As people start developing as large corporations, companies like the National Broadcasting Network, NBC, would create television, they had already figured out this, that they understood, based on the earlier example of radio, how this is going to work. This is going to work through advertising. Television is going to be broadcast. And just like radio, television was free. And because of that, television was created not to be interesting or educational or enlightening to the audience. No, it was created to distract people from the fact that what was really involved with television was creating an audience to sit through advertisements. That's what it really is. The real product of television was the audience. It was the audience that was being sold. Television was free to people because they were the thing that was actually being sold. You were being sold to advertisers. All right? And so there's almost a large matrix-like conspiracy with radio and television earlier on, whereas we are simply creating content to distract you from the fact that what we're really trying to do is find a way to make you sit in front of a television or sit next to a radio and listen to advertisements. That's what's going on. Broadcast television is the same way. But the reason things like Netflix or HBO doesn't have advertisements on it is precisely because you pay a subscription for that. You pay a fee. You have to pay to watch Netflix, and therefore there's not a subscription basis for it. That doesn't, by the way, mean you're not also being sold. Information about you is being gathered on things like from HBO and Netflix and being sold, but not in terms of advertisement on there. Jim Collin, in your book, makes an interesting observation, a very true observation about television, where he says that television was and is the least democratic of the popular arts. So think about what we've talked about. Minstrel shows, which were basically live performance shows, movies, jazz music, talk about rock and roll. Of all of these that we've talked about, and we can include other things, popular sports, comic books, various types of popular culture. Collin argues that television is the least democratic. What does he mean by the way, we're not talking about Democratic Party, Republican Party. We're talking about democracy. Well, television is very much controlled by large corporations. It costs incredible amounts of money to make television programming. And television programming requires, especially early on when there were just basically three large networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, large audiences to watch these things. So of the content you received, television was controlled by an incredibly small number of people, a very select number of corporations. Let's take an inverse example, a genre of popular culture that tends to be a bit more democratic. The history of comic books. See, comic books are relatively inexpensive to produce. You could produce very cheaply. One person by themselves could print up a comic book, create it themselves, write the story, illustrate it, get it printed up in small batches, hundreds, a few thousands, and distribute and sell those. Anybody that wants to create a comic book can create a comic book. Today now with digital technology, that much more easy. You can do that. But a broadcast television show? Can't do that. Some young man or some young woman sitting in their bedroom cannot just create a television show and put it on broadcast network. Okay, you can put it on YouTube today. And this is one of the reasons why things like YouTube are disrupting the broadcast television industry. But initially, you couldn't just do that. Right? It costs tremendous amounts of money to create television programming, and therefore it was very much controlled by large corporations. Okay. Now I put a question mark on there, and Cullen, in your chapter on this area of television in the book, also says, now look, yes, it was controlled by large corporations, National Broadcasting System, CBS, Columbia Broadcasting System, ABC, American Broadcast, very large corporation. However, it doesn't mean they 100% get to determine what the public is going to like. As much as a television network can try to force us to like something, doesn't mean we are going to like it. And so therefore, these large corporations had to be willing to adapt based on what became popular with the public. They had to be willing to change and adapt. So it's not like some if television is the least democratic of the popular arts, aspects of popular culture, that doesn't mean it's a totalitarian dictatorship where the company simply gets to dictate everything. Because if the public didn't like what the television network was producing and stopped watching, they're not going to be able to find advertisers, and they would eventually go out of business. So there was ways in which the public, based on their viewing habits and their likes and dislikes, could influence television networks to create different kinds of programming based on what they seem to like and what they seem to not like. All right? Let's talk about some of the effects of television on American ways of life. And to me, this is one of the most fascinating things about the emergence of television. Historians have talked about, after World War II, a kind of domestication that happens to American life. Americans come to be more homebodies, spend more time at home than earlier generations of Americans. Now, one big factor in this was suburbanization. After World War II, more people were leaving big cities and living in outlying suburban areas. The picture I have for you in this slide is homes being built in Lakewood, California, right here in Southern California. Lakewood is a great example of a post-World War II suburban community that sort of sprang up in the years after the war. The creation of tract homes, where increasingly after World War II, homes were being built almost more in a kind of assembly-like production, where there were a more limited number of options to choose. Prior to World War II, more homes were built in a custom, one-off manner. But after World War II, entire neighborhoods were increasingly being built that were built with a limited number of styles that were being built. In the neighborhood where I grew up, it was a post-World War II home. And there were basically four types of homes in my neighborhood. You could drive down my neighborhood and you could see the four different types. One of the styles in my neighborhood was a home with a slanted roof. And you could drive down the street and count one. You'd see one of those slanted roofs and you just look over. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you would back and there would be another home with a slanted roof. And you'd go down the street. 1, 2, 3, 4, and there'd be a home with another slanted roof. Tract homes were built with similar designs. The fixtures that would be bought for the homes would be mass produced, and so home builders could build these homes more cheaply. Right? They could buy in bulk, and they didn't have to pay for custom designs for 350 homes. No, they had to pay an architect to design 4 homes, and they would replicate those homes in the community. Prices came down for homes after the war because of this, almost like I said, mass production style of suburban tract home living. And so housing became more affordable. More and more people, home ownership increased by more than 50% between the year 1945, when World War II ended, and 1960. There was just this tremendous growth in domestic home building after the war. And because people were living increasingly in the suburbs, where land was cheaper, and you could build these tract homes, it was further away from sort of urban activities that people could be involved in. When my wife and I were first married, our first 10 years of marriage, we lived in Los Angeles. We lived in mid-city LA. And I lived in this neighborhood called the Miracle Mile. And I didn't have to drive around very much when I did things there because it was the city. I had friends that I would hang around with, and there were bars in my neighborhood, and I could meet friends at bars, and I'd just walk there and very conveniently, if I had a few drinks, walk home after I was done. There were movie theaters I could walk to. My grocery store was 2 blocks away from my home. I could go there and walk home with a couple handfuls, if it's just my wife and I, so we didn't need that many groceries. I could walk there. There were even places to see concerts. I lived a block away from the El Rey Theater on Melrose and could go to shows at the El Rey. I was out of my house a lot. There were coffee shops. There were bakeries. If I wanted a bagel, I'd just, leave my house and I'd go buy a bagel. And I would walk there. I was out of the house all the time. Now I live in the suburbs. And I drive to my home, and there are very few places I can walk to anymore. And so I'm at home more. And this is, the slide is titled Domestication of American Life. As American life became more suburban, people spent more time at home. They were more domesticated. Rather than out in the wild in the big city and hanging out and leaving the house to go do things, increasingly people were staying home. Television was also part of this domestication, because not only were you now increasingly in your suburban home, but even for people who weren't living in the suburb, even for people that were living in the city, once you got a television, you had less reason to want to leave the home to go entertain yourself. There's fascinating studies, and there were people that were aware of it at the time. Because of the nature of television, we talked a lot. Television was big business, and it cost a lot of money. Well, television was implemented in different places at different times in the United States. The first television stations were located in large cities in the 1950s. Actually, 1940s they started. New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, big cities. Okay. And sociologists, and then later on historians, started to notice really interesting things. What happened to a city that got a television station. People stayed home more. You saw declines in things happening outside the home. Circulation in local libraries decreased. So New York City gets a television station, starts broadcasting television. People in New York City start buying televisions. Guess what? Every minute that you are watching TV is a minute you are not reading a book. So guess what happened to library circulation numbers? Decreased. Restaurants started to see fewer patrons come into restaurants because people were staying home. In fact, a whole new type of cuisine develops, come to be known as TV dinners. Already pre-made meals that could be heated up in the oven. Later on, when microwaves are invented, they could be used in microwaves. But the whole idea with these meals were that these meals could be consumed while you watched TV. You didn't go out to a restaurant. You could eat one of these TV dinners and sit down and watch it while you eat it while you watched TV. Movies were less attended once television started to come about. All these different ways, and you could predict these things that would happen as we knew this wasn't a nationwide trend because these things weren't happening in cities that didn't have a television station. So, for example, a smaller city like Indianapolis, while New York City was seeing drop in book reading and library circulation and movie attendance and restaurant patrons, none of that was happening in Indianapolis because they didn't have TV stations yet. So people were still going to the library in great numbers. People were still going to movies and people were still going to restaurants. But then once Indianapolis got its own broadcast television networks, you almost predictably, you could see those declines in library circulation and movie attendance and things like that. People were staying home more. And not only were they staying home more, were people becoming more privatized and domesticated, but there was less interaction for the family. Instead of spending time talking to family members, maybe doing things like playing board games, people were watching TV all together. Now they were sitting all together, they're all next to each other, but they weren't talking, they weren't engaging, they were just watching TV. Okay, and so you see this way in which television very quickly, from the late 40s, by the middle 1950s, where there are millions of televisions in homes, is really transforming the nature of life, where people are going, what people are doing. It was incredible, the effects that television were having. All right. Let's talk about television and consumerism. This whole unit in popular culture, we've been talking about consumerism because so much of what popular culture is related to consumerism. Minstrel shows, jazz, television, rock and roll, movies. You wouldn't have had these things if people weren't willing to pay to participate in these. With television, yes, you didn't have to pay for the programming, but you did have to buy a television. So just like with other forms of popular culture, but even more so, television was intimately involved with consumerism, more so than any other form of popular culture. So take, for example, just the starting point, the television itself, right? The television itself was a consumer item, all right? A significant consumer item. This ad I give to you from the year 1950, this television being advertised, look, they're bragging about it's a 16-inch television. They're bragging about that. Most of you probably have larger laptop screens that you're looking at than this 16-inch television here. It cost $299, basically $300 plus tax in 1950. To give you a sense of that in our money, today that would be more than $3,000 that they're advertising. That was a lot of money. $300 was a lot in 1950. So the purchase of a TV was a significant family expense at the time. So just the television itself was a consumer item. But the programming, as we've talked about, was all based on advertising, right? Advertising to entice you to buy things, to encourage you to buy things. That was the whole purpose. That the television was simply a consumerism advertising machine to get you to want to buy stuff. Without consumerism, without advertising, television would have ceased immediately to exist. That was its whole purpose, was to entice consumers. So the programming was on there, was based on advertisers. Whether it was a single advertiser that would pay for an entire show, or later on as it develops more as multiple advertisers creating discrete ads during the programming that would pay for the creation of the shows. One of the early really popular genres of programming on television was the game show. Television networks like game shows because they were relatively cheap to produce. You didn't really require writers. You didn't need complicated sets. You didn't really have to pay actors. Game shows were really popular. And often game shows involved guessing prices for items or winning consumer goods as a prize for doing well on the game show. Really popular genre, and game shows were just straight up raw commercialism. All right. Last thing we'll talk about here is some interesting connections between television and gender during the 1950s. The 1950s was particularly a time of anxiety about gender roles, men being men and women being women. Some of this anxiety had to do with World War II. Women famously worked, many women worked outside of the home during World War II. The image of Rosie the Riveter, the idea of this character of Rosie the Riveter that the government created to encourage women to come and work, was viewed as a necessity during the war. As millions of American men were in uniform and fighting overseas, the United States needed to produce military goods and other goods to keep the economy and the war effort alive while these men were gone. But then after the war was over, there was this anxiety. Almost like America had let the genie out of the bottle. For so much of American history, American men had told women, you can't work. Only men can do this. You're too delicate. And yet during the war, women were working as welders and riveters, and they were building tanks and guns and bombs and vacuum tubes. Well, you can't lie to them now. And so there was this anxiety of, we need to get things back to the old ways, where men work and women stay home. So after World War II, there was this tremendous push for a kind of reassertion of traditional gender roles, where men work and women stay at home. There was anxiety about this. There were elements of the Cold War, the later rivalry with the Soviet Union after World War II, that would also accelerate this concern over gender roles. But one of the ways you could see this attempt to emphasize traditional gender roles after World War II is on television. In fact, this would be one of the most simple, straightforward ways to explain this to somebody. Like if you're trying to explain to somebody, like, oh, just like I've been doing. After World War II, there was concern about men being men and making sure women were still women and men were public and working and women were at home and domestic and not working, where would be some evidence that you could prove this to people? Show them TV shows from the 1950s. On these television shows, men were the ones that were almost always doing the work. Who was at home? Who was cooking? Who was cleaning? Mom. In fact, on a lot of these television shows, 1950s, well into 1960s sitcom, you rarely even saw women depicted outside of the home. They were just sort of always there. Mom, cooking. Dad would come home from work and mom would just, right at that time, mom would be pulling out a pot roast. Good timing, dear. And, she was ready to serve that food to her man. Colin, in your book, talks about the popularity of Westerns, cowboy shows, in the 1950s on television. In 1958, there were 25 different prime-time television shows based on Westerns. Right? That's not even including daytime stuff and other stuff and movies that were also being shown on the TV. Just 25 prime-time shows. The cowboy movie, the cowboy TV show, the cowboy in general is this kind of traditional American masculine figure. The strong, silent type that can both inflict and absorb violence. If you want to see one of the great expressions of American masculinity, it's the cowboy show. For women, there was daytime programming, soap operas that became popular. Now, there were earlier adaptations of this in radio serial shows before. There were radio soap opera dramas, and they were simply just brought onto TV. Why were they daytime dramas? Because the assumption that women stay home. Women are not working. And so therefore we'll put those on available for them to watch during the day. And we don't have to worry about men not liking them, because the idea was men were at work during this time. So women could watch this programming during the day. So if we want to understand certain aspects of post-World War II gender roles, we can see them reflected in this post-World War television environment. Okay, everybody, that's enough for this talk. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.